is the prevalence of ADHD higher among people who have migraines? We're looking at brains, people.
COVID happened and the lockdown happened, and they really wanted to study whether or not telehealth can be effective treatment in the mental health realm.
Yep, I feel terrible. I don't want to get anything done. This is just a day in my ADHD life. Let's continue.
I mean, it also speaks to a little bit how we need different types of support.
This week, we have 3 interesting papers, one looking at gender differences in adults with ADHD, one looking at telehealth systems during COVID and the effect that they may have had on people's ADHD support. And then the last one, and I think very interestingly, looking at adults with ADHD who have migraines, which I know is something that a lot of my clients have had, and I'm sure a lot of you have as well. So let's dive straight into it. Sarah, the first paper was looking at 6 differences in medication-naïve adults with ADHD. And medication-naïve adults means adults who are not taking medication for their ADHD. And this paper came from biological psychology. And basically what they wanted to do was they wanted to measure 6 differences in ADHD neurobiology during interference control tests. So we're looking at brains, people. Very excited to be looking at brains. Tell me what they did.
So they did fMRIs and they also did some cognitive tests. This study was done in Taiwan at the university hospital. So the sample was recruited sort of within that space. ADHD was assessed by clinical interview. They had a pretty even split in terms of sample sizes, 55 ADHD adults and then 52 neurotypical controls. The men and women split were also pretty even within those 2 groups. So I thought that was cool.
Yeah. And they did the Stroop test, which we've talked about before, but for those of who haven't, do you want to just give us a sense of what that is?
So they actually did a really weird Stroop task. So let's tease this one out together because it's really interesting. Basically, the Stroop test is, they give you a rule like the word is associated with the picture in this way. And then you have to pick the correct response. But in the way that they did this, they called it congruent, incongruent, and then control. Basically, the correct answer was they were looking for the number of words that they were showing you. But then they ran it 3 different ways. And I'm a little bit unclear like who they gave them to or if they gave everyone a combination of the different tests. But basically, the congruent condition means that the number of words that they showed you was the answer.
Right.
So the number and the meaning were consistent. In the incongruent condition, the number and the meaning were inconsistent, which means like it's not what I'm showing you, which is so weird. And then they had a control condition, which was random. So the meaning of the words did not give any clue to their number. So it was probably just, again, they called it the control condition. So I can only imagine that they were just testing for people who were like just doing sort of like rapid tapping, because all you have to do to answer this question is to tap a button on a computer. And then they also sort of, the stimuli changes and then you have to respond again. And sometimes it takes a while for them to change. And then sometimes it's really short. They sort of went back and forth between that. These tests are really meant to demonstrate your ability to answer correctly, to discern the important information, and to be able to do that quickly.
Right. And so in terms of the results, was it what we tend to see in terms of ADHD results when it comes to that Stroop test?
So it's interesting because I didn't actually really look at the results of the task itself, because the real important information was the brain scans that they did while these people were doing the test. They do talk about it in the paper. I'm totally honest. I didn't even read it because I didn't think that was the part we were going to focus on.
Sorry.
No, you're good. So I will say that some of the activation patterns that they observed was correlated with a lower score on the Stroop task. So yes, it is what we've seen before.
Yes, yes. Well, let's get into, the brain. What was it doing?
First, I'm going to start off by saying there were no significant differences between like age and IQ among the ADHD and non-ADHD groups. I think that's really important to point out. There also weren't differences between the men and women with ADHD groups in terms of like their clinical symptom presentation. So everybody was sort of on a relatively even playing field, if you'll say.
Yeah, that is interesting.
But then they observed some interesting activation patterns, like I said. So basically, the ADHD participants had a reduced activation in the caudate nucleus. We had to look up all of these sort of areas of the brain because these aren't ones we hear about all the time. Skye, do you want to talk about that one a little bit? Because you have it on your screen. And then also the inferior frontal gyrus.
Yeah, so the inferior frontal gyrus is kind of in the part of the brain that we tend to associate with struggles with ADHD, which is to say the sort of front half of your brain at the top. If you were wearing a helmet, it would be that front section of the helmet where you tend to be talking about when we're talking about that. So the inferior frontal gyrus is associated with that, and it's associated with impairment and organization and the same sort of things that you would see there. But the precuneus and the caudate nucleus, which are the two areas they saw as well, the precuneus is kind of further into the brain, and it's associated in terms of if it gets damaged with consciousness disorders, with issues with processing, visuospatial, which I thought was interesting because I know with ADHD, at least we've talked a lot about struggles with moving in space, and these kinds of things can be associated, as well as struggles with memory and memory impairment. And then the caudate nucleus is very much it's hard to explain, but like where your ears are and you just go straight through. It's kind of in the middle between your ears. That's kind of the space that it's in. Known as kind of like it's a deep space that's often associated with early development of human brains and what we tend to see in other brains. Anyway, I'll stop talking about brains. What they found specifically is that this area is associated with obsessive compulsive disorder, hyperactivity, and drive. And so it's to do a little bit with emotional processing as well as storing and processing memories. So we're seeing a lot of that kind of higher level executive functioning processing, but we're also seeing a lot of that deeper emotional memory processing as well being affected. So quite a large range of things, but all associated with ADHD.
Yeah. So I'm just going to say again, they sort of scanned these people's brains while they were doing these cognitive tasks because they really wanted to see the areas of the brain that are responsible for filtering information. And they found reduced activation in areas of the brain associated with planning, memory, emotion, attentional control. I mean, that's the stuff, right?
Yeah.
They also found that the women had greater activation patterns in the areas of the brain that were responsible for like the interference control, sort of filtering out that extra stimuli. So that was elevated in women compared to men, which the authors sort of go on to talk about how that would sort of lead to people struggling to adapt to dysregulated environments and situations. They specifically say demanding situations, but really think overwhelming. Think lots of stimuli. Think inability to filter it. Think overstimulation.
Yeah. No, I can imagine.
Yeah. And that was really interesting. And they called that a novel finding, sort of those specific areas of the brain. So very cool.
Yeah, no, definitely very cool. So if we were to think about, I guess, a practical implication, and then we'll talk a little bit about, some ADHD strategies that are kind of related to this paper, but what are the overall practical implications in terms of what this paper is doing? I mean, it's adding to the brain research that we have, but it's particularly focusing on women.
I think they did that sort of by accident. They did talk about how lots of research sort of has excluded women in the past, and so they've got to work out the gap.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's interesting because, when you're talking about medical research, a lot of medical research, there's been discussions about women's brains and men's brains and all that kind of thing. And, the idea of the differences, I don't know if you heard, but they talked about like heart attacks appear really differently depending on
Yes.
your sex. So that can kind of have an effect. And it might be the same for brains. Like maybe brains look different and brain scans look different. So it is interesting to have those conversations. And then in terms of the practical applications for this, I mean, I think we were talking about it before we came on. And one of the interesting things that was the fact that, all of those 3 different areas of the brain that were affected had something to do with memory, memory process, learning, remembering, accessing emotions around memories. And, with ADHD, we know we struggle with working memory. So this is kind of just a reminder of that, and a reminder that, if you do find yourself struggling with working memory, it's really important to be able to access your memories as quickly as possible because the brain scans indicate that that might be difficult to do. So any way that you can kind of make it easier for yourself and resist the urge to be like, I'll remember that. I don't need to write that down. I don't need to tell somebody. I don't need to put it in my phone. I mean, I personally have so many different ways of putting in information. I have like an audio to text on my phone. I have different notes on my phone. We have different places that we put things in for different spaces. And that is because of what we find in those brain scans.
Yeah, I mean, I have sort of different tools for different things, but when my baby was a newborn, for example, I had to get like a baby app so that I could track when I fed him, when I changed him, things like that.
Oh, yeah.
Because, when you hear someone crying and you don't know why, and you can't remember when's the last time they did X, Y, Z, having that app really saved me, I think, a lot. But yeah, and that's just like a really simple example. Strategies look different for everybody. The brain stuff sort of suggests that we're all going to struggle with things to different degrees, but working memory support is really important.
Yeah.
For like all of us.
If you've been thinking, I need to just remember it, surely that's a thing. This research indicates that it is not a thing and there is a struggle with memory and it is in our brain. And so, yeah, if you can give yourself some support for that using some of these strategies, that's a really helpful thing to do.
We know that ADHD can feel overwhelming and frustrating, and that's on a good day. And we don't want anyone to have to navigate that alone.
That's why we created the ADHD Academy, where adults with ADHD can meet, join, share stories, and support each other in a judgment-free way. If you want to connect with others who truly understand you and learn research-based strategies to help you feel more in control and build momentum in your life and work, you found the right place.
Together, let's transform your ADHD challenges into strengths. If you'd like to know more, you can click the link below to join us in the ADHD Academy.
Hope to see you there. Okay, let's move on to the second paper, which has a really complicated title. So I'm actually not going to say it, but the title essentially is what it found. So it also gives it away. So this is Frontiers in Psychiatry. This is the journal it comes from. And what they really wanted to know was who is most likely to benefit from telehealth services. And it's important to mention that this study was done during COVID. So that is obviously having a big effect on who's using telehealth and how they're using telehealth. And they wanted to look at people who had ADHD, but they also included people who had depression and ADHD. So that is a factor as well. So take us through how they did this study, Sarah.
So this study was done in Germany. Most of the participants were recruited from outpatient clinic. I'm not going to even try to pronounce all the names. Central Institute of Mental Health. Basically, COVID happened and the lockdown happened, and they really wanted to study whether or not telehealth can be effective treatment in the mental health realm. So they recruited sort of a bunch of patients. 54 of them had diagnosed depression. 67 had diagnosed ADHD.
So that was a clinical diagnosis as well. That's not self-reported.
Yeah.
And it said like a third of them had both ADHD and depression, which is a high number, but it does make some sense if we're talking about an outpatient clinic.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they broke it down even further into like whether ADHD or depression was the first diagnosis. So like it's a lot of numbers, but the total sample was 254. They tried to get a longitudinal aspect to it, and they sort of reviewed people's medical records and psychiatric histories, socio-demographic data, things like that. But basically, this whole study was observational. So it was like, let's see what happens if we give people this survey and then they do teletherapy for a period of time. And let's sort of see whether their survey scores improve.
Yeah. There's a lot going on in this paper, so we're not necessarily going to bring it all to the table. We're just going to identify the relevant pieces and some of the more interesting things that they found specifically. So what did they find for ADHD? How was ADHD improved or not improved by the telehealth support, Sarah?
Basically, ADHD females as a category had no observed improvement when we're looking at the well-being index that they gave them. They also said that people with ADHD who also scored high on the depressive survey were the least likely to benefit from this type of intervention. They sort of also talk about how satisfaction with the treatment was equal for both groups, but that didn't correlate with a patient improvement in any group.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well. They talked specifically about people who had children and who didn't have children. And this was kind of interesting because, again, we mentioned that it was during COVID. So obviously, you know, although we don't know exactly what their experiences were like, we can surmise that these children were in very close quarters, probably across the room as they did that survey, I imagine.
Yeah, the authors even say that since there's a genetic component to ADHD, it's likely that some of those patients also have ADHD children, which presents unique challenges.
Definitely. And so they found that people without children benefited more from this telehealth. And they surmised that maybe having children was affecting their ability to do
engage
telehealth.
In the treatment.
Yeah.
I mean, it also speaks to a little bit how we need different types of support. You know, people with children need different types of support as people without. People with depression need different types of supports as without. People who are depressed and have children also have unique support needs, you know? But yeah, I mean, I wrote in the little comments in our document, like, I don't think that was the telehealth's doing.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a tricky combination of things that kind of came to the fore. So if you were to summarize what they found, Sarah.
So if I was to summarize this, basically ADHD population didn't have much improvement with the teletherapy. Now, again, the way that they measured improvement was a well-being index. Sort of a really short 5-question survey, but it asks you things like, over the last 2 weeks, have you felt this? And it's things like, I awake rested with energy, or, you know, I've been cheerful, and things like that. And again, I mean, how much of that is the mental health and how much of that is the sociological malaise associated with COVID?
Yeah, COVID and kids, which we know was quite a lot. So it's the results of this are tricky to pinpoint, but if we were to take the sort of practical implications of this paper, the practical implications of this paper have to do a little bit more with children and ADHD than anything else. And the fact that, you know, having kids can have an effect on your ability to engage with ADHD support services. And so one of the strategies that we can take from that is that you might need to negotiate with the support services that you want to get to find something that works for you if you have kids, or if you have something, you know, some other care that requires you to be a lot more flexible. Maybe you can't do sustained quiet space attention for a while. Maybe you need to do kind of a back and forth text messaging service. Maybe you just need to be more friendly to kids so that you can bring the kids into what you're doing as well.
That is a really interesting suggestion. I haven't seen anyone suggest that anywhere, but yeah, absolutely. Make these things more like co-experiences.
Yeah. Well, it's particularly because, I mean, obviously kids are very distracting and all that kind of thing, especially if they have ADHD and they might be experiencing ADHD symptoms as well. But there might be a way to kind of broaden the experience to make it more family focused if you are going to focus on kids. And if you're somebody with ADHD, asking and negotiating and knowing that that's important for you to get the most out of it might be something you need to do.
Not for nothing. It would have saved me a lot of time if I had just brought my mother to therapy for show and tell. So this could work in the sort of children's way as well. They can sort of witness the experiences that you're having, witness how you respond to those experiences, and then be able to tailor like what is going to help you in that moment.
Exactly.
What are you experiencing in that moment? So actually, it might be a really brilliant idea.
Yeah. Well, I will say, well, that's what we do. I will say, with the ADHD Academy, we have group coaching and there are regularly kids on the group coaching call. We do have the ability to, we do mute and that kind of thing, but people can care for their children and still listen to the call. And then if they can't necessarily engage, by turning on, maybe they'll write a message in the chat and we'll chat as if they were sort of saying that message. Maybe they'll just come on and then mute themselves once they've said something. So we try to bring that flexibility in for that reason. A lot of people in the academy have kids and we have kids too, so we understand it. There is that to take into account when you're talking about ADHD support services. Okay. So our third paper is an interesting one. I don't know if I've seen a paper on this topic, possibly one, but it's something that comes up a lot with clients, which is the effect or just the connection between ADHD and migraines in adults. And this is something that I've spoken about before, and I actually forwarded this paper to a few people once I'd seen it because I know it's something that we've definitely talked about. So it's from our old friend, the Journal of Attention Disorders. And basically, the research question was very, very simple, which is great. It's just, is the prevalence of ADHD higher among people who have migraines? Sarah, how did they do the study?
So this study is another outpatient sample. So they recruited people who were going to a headache clinic.
It's a good idea.
Sort of 100. Yeah. 250 was the total sample, 100 with migraines, 150 without, predominantly female, 90 and 85% respectively.
Wow. That's a whole other study. How many people have migraines? Women. Apparently a lot of women. Yeah.
Yikes. And then I think it's important to define, they were looking specifically at people who have episodic migraines, which is different from those with chronic migraines. So people were diagnosed with episodic migraines by a neurologist. And that means that they have episodes less than 15 days per month, which is still a lot of days to have a headache.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Plenty of days to have a headache, but it's enough that it might be something that's in the background of their life rather than in the foreground.
Yeah. So people who have chronic migraines and those taking certain drugs were excluded from this. ADHD was all self-report. They also looked at an impulsivity scale that I've never seen before.
What did they find then? Tell us about, what did they find with the migraines?
It's a lot to sum up here. So I think the long and the short of it is that they didn't find a statistically significant relationship, but there are some strong tendencies toward association, like quotes. Yeah. So let me break it down a little bit. Presence of migraine and severity of migraine were not associated with ADHD symptomology.
Okay.
So that was interesting. But when you're looking at sort of the inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity scores, they were all higher in the migraine group than compared to the control group.
Right. So specific elements of ADHD scores appeared to be associated with the presence of migraines, but not ADHD itself.
So I think the important part is not statistically significant because they did find a relationship, but I think it was like a p.1.
Yeah, which is what we usually want to be seeing, a 0.05.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But they went on to explain it anyway.
Yeah, well, so they talk about specifically impulsivity and hyperactivity seem to be the most prevalent in the ADHD group.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
They go on to talk about how the areas of the brain that are involved in impulsivity and hyperactivity are also the same areas of the brain that are involved in migraines, from what they speculate.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I guess, what is it? And this is to show my ignorance of understanding of research behind migraines. So you might not know the side of this area, but what is the reason for the migraines then, according to what they're saying? Are they saying that different parts of your brain have ways of working that create a tendency towards migraines? Or is it that maybe there was some damage to your brain that's creating migraines? Or did they mention?
They do talk about it a little bit in their introduction. So they say, I mean, we don't really understand ADHD either, but let's see, what does it say specifically? There are several cortical and subcortical structures that participate in events underlying both disorders.
Okay.
That is a funny way to say that. It's a great question. They don't really get into it, but I'm curious now.
Yeah, me too. We should probably talk to somebody about migraines because I think it's definitely interesting. And that kind of actually relates to our practical implications. I mean, obviously the practical implications are the idea of ADHD being connected to migraines. But given that they didn't talk about this, what we're going to talk about now is some strategies if you do happen to have ADHD and you're struggling with migraines, because we both worked with people who have migraines and, have ADHD. So one of the things that people often talk about if you have migraines with ADHD is the idea of keeping a diary. That's a pretty common recommendation. With ADHD, it can be really hard to keep that diary because sometimes the diary is a little bit too complicated. So what I tend to recommend is trying to find a way to simplify it as much as possible. Do you have to provide all the data, or can you just have something that buzzes a couple of times a day or a couple of times a week and just says, like, these are the 3 ways you could be feeling, maybe associated with an emoji. Just tap the emoji related to how you're feeling right now. Or maybe you go back over your day or a couple of times a week and at that point you say which phase you're in. Sometimes it's better to have some data than no data because you were given this really complicated hour by hour migraine form to fill out and you didn't because executive functioning.
Yeah, it can be as simple as putting a marker on your calendar, just a little dot, and that indicates it was a headache day. You can put your least favorite color. You know what? If you even have to sort of say, like, well, how do I know I have a headache? Like, is this a water headache? Or is this a migraine? Like, don't get nitpicky. Like, if you have a headache, then mark it on the calendar. It's so important for anyone with ADHD and any sort of medical condition to keep some kind of tracker, because what tends to happen is we get into these appointments and we have nothing to share, and that can lead to sort of underdiagnosis or like just not receiving the care that you need because you didn't know how to perform in an appointment setting. Yeah. Having that to give to someone can just eliminate the talking aspect as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I would also say that one of the things that is quite helpful with migraines specifically is getting a sense of what kind of migraine day it is. Like, it doesn't have to be overly complicated, but I do know from people I've worked with who have migraines that there are those days where you have the migraine and are there the days when you you kind of know it's coming, or the days after it where you might not have a migraine at this point, but you're not feeling 100%. You're kind of having a bit of a post-migraine. So also getting comfortable with that, like giving words to the experience, because often we're just trying to get through things, and that makes a lot of sense. And so we're just kind of going, okay, cool. I guess I felt bad. I don't know. I don't want to write it down. I just want to keep going. And that can kind of stop us from acknowledging, like, hey, this is taking up 50% of my month, or 30% of my week, and I need to be nice to myself. And it can be hard. I recommend, maybe working with a therapist or someone to, really focus in on, acknowledging how much this might be affecting you, because it can be hard to really do that, but it can also be helpful, and it can kind of liberate us from being so judgmental, trying to be like, oh, why aren't I getting everything done?
Well, yeah. And because once you understand like what's happening and what triggers it, then you can put strategies in place. Like my optometrist suggested that I get migraine glasses, which are different from blue light glasses. They are like rose colored. They're super cool looking. And apparently that also helps to filter the light. Hypersensitivity to light is a thing that we can experience. It's just another one of those sensory things, those neat sensory quirks that we have. But yeah, there's stuff you can do about it. Alternatively, if it's sound, that's your trigger, like noise canceling headphones,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So putting those strategies in place, small systems at a time, building from there. It doesn't have to be fixing the whole thing, but just those little movements towards figuring it out. And if you do have headaches and you are curious, there does appear to be some correlation, although obviously we don't have all of the data and it's not significant, between that and ADHD. So I'm excited to see what else people come out with in this area, because I definitely think that it's something that I've heard of a number of times.
Yeah, absolutely. So many sort of chronic medical conditions that can be comorbid, and that's okay. It's just really important to know so that we can educate people on what is happening to their bodies. I can't tell you how many times I've had a headache, but then not realized it.
Yeah.
Until much later.
Yeah. With ADHD, we're just out here just powering through life. Well, sometimes not, but, just kind of being like, yep, I feel terrible. I don't want to get anything done. This is just a day in my ADHD life. Let's continue. And sometimes that is the case, and sometimes that is not the case. Okay. Well, yeah, 3 very different papers and 3 strategies that hopefully you could take something away from. We're going to be doing a little bit more of a focus on the skills and strategies along with the research this year. So hopefully you guys can take something away from every episode. Awesome. Have a great week, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for another research recap. Goodbye. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to reach out or connect with us, you can leave us a message at admin@unconventionalorganization.com.
You can also find out more about our ADHD coaching organization, read our free articles, or sign up to our online courses at unconventionalorganization.com. That's organization with a Z or an S. They both will get you there.
If you'd like to learn more about what we discussed here today, or you want to read the transcript, you can find that at our show notes page at unconventionalorganization.com.
If you've enjoyed this podcast and think someone else might find the strategies and stories helpful, the best thing you can do is share episodes using the share button in the podcast player, or leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify or your podcast player of choice, letting them know why you've benefited from this podcast.
Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you back in the ADHD lab next week.